All right, confirmation crew, if you can take your seats, we can get started. Thank you. You bet. All right, if you can hear me, clap once. Can you hear me, clap twice. Can you hear me, clap 3 times. Perfect. Welcome back to Confirmation. Before we dive into everything that we're going to talk about tonight, quick announcement about next week. As Pastor Chris and I were talking about in the announcements right before the service, we will be also doing a First Communion class at the same time as Confirmation next week. So I know there's about 10 of you who have not yet had First Communion. At least that was what was listed on your registrations. I will be sending out more communications to your parents. I'll give you guys a call just to let you guys know how that's going to happen. But how it'll work is those of you who have not had First Communion class yet, instead of being part of the large and small groups next week, you will join with us in the lounge to do the First Communion stuff because it's happening at the same time as Confirmation. So once we get to this point, whoever's going to be teaching this or however we work it, we'll have that announcement saying, First Communion folks, head into the lounge, and then we'll start Confirmation here. So you don't have to do like extra time or that kind of thing. It's going to be happening at the same time. More information will be going out by email. Okay, looking to our topic for tonight, we are continuing our walk through the Old Testament, and we're starting to speed up now. We've only got I think it's 4 or 5 lessons left about our Old Testament stuff, and we've gotten through how many books? Does anyone know how many books we've talked about so far? Can anyone name any of the books we've talked about? Genesis, which means what? Beginning. What else? Exodus, which means what? Exit. And then there were 2 that we talked about last week. Joshua, yes, that was one of them. And the other one, it had to do with someone like Samson was one of these people. Yeah, Kieran. Close. Exodus, we had that one already. Gavin? Leviticus, not Leviticus. We actually haven't talked about Leviticus, but that is a good guess. Yeah, no. Judges, absolutely. We talked about Judges. So, the 4 books that we've talked about so far, Genesis, Exodus, Joshua, and Judges. And we're going to be speeding up and covering a bunch of other ones. In fact, tonight we're actually going to be covering topics that have 4 different books of the Bible that kind of refer to them. Who could tell me something about the book of Genesis? What stories are talked about in Genesis? Over here. Adam and Eve. Yes, that's a story in the book of Genesis. Yes, sir. Noah's Ark, absolutely. The what? The first 7 days of creation, absolutely. There's a whole bunch of stuff. We also talked about Abraham and Sarah, right, and their kids, and Jacob and Esau, all these people. All of that stuff is in that first book of Genesis. What about Exodus? Who could tell me something about the book of Exodus that we've talked about? Any of the people that were involved in Exodus? Any of the stories that were involved in Exodus? We know that Exodus means exit. So who was exiting and where were they going and why? Yeah.
I don't remember who.
Sure.
But
They were leaving a town.
Yeah.
Yep. And going. Something about Moses and the Red Sea. Absolutely. Yes. Anyone want to build on that? They were leaving a town, and it was something about Moses and the Red Sea. Gavin, what you got for me? Yes, they were leaving Egypt to save themselves from being killed by the Pharaoh. Who was leaving Egypt? Who's they? Who are the people that were leaving Egypt? Yeah, Olivia. The Israelites, absolutely. The people of God, the ones we've been kind of following the story from all the way back from the book of Genesis. Most of the Old Testament is about the Israelites, the people of Israel. Now, does anybody remember, and this is kind of a deep cut, does anybody remember why they're called the Israelites? Where does the name Israel come from? Yes. Jacob. Oh, that is such a good memory. Yeah. Israel is the name that God gives to Jacob after the whole wrestling until dawn thing and giving him the new name where he put his hip out of joint and says, you will have so many descendants, there will be more than the stars in the sky. And that's where the term Israel comes from. And so that's the people, the descendants of Jacob that we're following through that story. All right, so we had Moses in the Exodus. Last time we talked about Joshua. Who can tell me what Joshua did? What was his deal? Any ideas? So he comes after Moses. Moses is leading the people out across the Red Sea, out of Egypt. They get into the desert. They get the 10 Commandments. That was the whole picture of this whole deal. And then they all chose to follow God and were happy forever and ever, right? No. What happened in the desert? Did they listen to God? They did not. They forgot to trust God. And so what ends up happening is that they keep wandering in the desert for how long? Does anybody remember what the Bible says? Close. Yeah, it was 39 plus 1. They had been wandering for 1 year, and then they ended up wandering for 39 more after they've already seen the promised land and decide they didn't really feel like going in. So they're wandering for 40 years, and in that time, this guy, Joshua, is the one who ends up taking over, right? And Joshua eventually leads them to Jericho, that city that they march around 7 times, and yeah, over here. You're Jericho. That's right. You are Jericho. And that was the city of Jericho that you are probably named for. They marched around 7 times. The walls fell down, and they got into the promised land. So once they got into the promised land, they started trusting God, and everything was hunky-dory forever, right? Right? No. It was not. That's where we get to that cycle of sin from the judges, right? This is what we talked about last time, where what would happen is the people would start failing to trust God, start falling away a little bit, and eventually they'd go down paths they weren't supposed to go down, and things would start turning not so great, right? People might come in and conquer them, or there'd be problems in the society, and they would call out to God. They said, God, we need help. We're not doing great. And so God would hear them and send a deliverer who was called a... You got it for me, Gavin? No? Someone said the word already. A judge, right? The judges were the people that God sent, and then they would be saved, and everything would be good, but then they'd fall away, and this cycle would continue over and over. This happened for a really, really, really long time. Now, there came a point that we're going to get to tonight where there was a guy named Samuel. Samuel is often seen as the final character of the judges. He's the last real judge that God calls up in the story of the people of Israel. Now, in the time that Samuel was the judge and prophet, you see I've also got Kingmaker up there because we're going to get to that. At that time, the people of Israel kind of looked around at their neighborhood, the other countries that surrounded them, and they saw that every other nation that surrounded them had something that they didn't have. And that was royalty. They had kings, they had queens, they had princes and princesses, they had royal courts that ruled over their neighbors. And that wasn't something that the people of God had. The Israelites did not have a king. They had judges in that whole cycle of retribution and sin and all that thing that came back around and around and around again. But they looked out at all their neighbors and they thought, man, that actually looks pretty good. There's at least some stability going on there, and we would kind of like to have a king. So the people of Israel went to Samuel, who was not only a judge but a prophet. And do you guys know what a prophet's job was? Any ideas what a prophet did? I'll give you a hint. It's not about telling the future. A prophet's job was to be kind of like a bridge, someone who would talk to God on behalf of the people and then also talk to the people on behalf of God. The people didn't pray. Prayer wasn't really a thing that the people of God did. That was the prophet's job. And so the people would go to the prophet and say, hey, we want you to tell God something. And so the prophet would go and talk to God, and then God would give a response, and the prophet would come and tell the people what God had said. So the people went to Samuel, the prophet, and said, Samuel, we want you to ask God to give us a king. All of our neighbors have kings. They all look like they're doing pretty great. Tell God that we want a king. And Samuel says to them, guys, trust me, you really don't want a king. A king, according to the book of Samuel, Samuel says, a king will going to do all kinds of terrible things. A king will take all of your money and your property and take your children to fight in wars and make all kinds of laws that aren't just and all of these things. You don't want a king, trust me. Well, the people of God said, I hear you say that, but look at the guys next door. They're doing okay. Just go, do your job as a prophet. Tell God that we want a king. Ask God to give us a king. So Samuel says, okay, I'm the prophet. I will go talk to God for you. So Samuel goes and prays to God and says, God, your people are asking me to ask you for a king. They want someone to lead them like their neighbors lead them. And God said to Samuel, look, I heard what you were saying to the people of Israel, and you were right. They really don't want a king. A king will do all those things that you said, and really they don't need a king. I am their God. They can follow me. They just need to trust me and trust that I'll take care of them. Go and tell the people that they don't need to have a king. So Samuel goes and tells the people of God, hey, here's what God said. I was right. You don't need a king. Trust God. Everything will be good. What do you think the people said? No thanks. Samuel, we want a king. That's the whole deal. We want to be like our neighbors, and we want God to give us a king. Go back to God and tell God to give us a king. All right. So Samuel goes back, tells God again, hey, the people still want a king. Do you think God changes his mind? He does, actually. He does. God says to Samuel, I've heard what the people say, and I know that a king is not going to be a great idea. They will be better off without a king, and you know that. But I love these people, and I want to do what they're wanting as well. So here's what we'll do. Tell the people that I have chosen someone to be their king. I've got my eye on a guy that I think is going to do the best job he can, and I'll help him out. I will lead him and do all the difficult parts and kind of work with him to be the best king he can be. And we'll see how it goes. So God sends Samuel to go find a guy named Saul, who becomes the first king of Israel. Samuel anoints him, which is a special kind of oil that he puts on his head and makes him king over Israel. And God blesses Saul in order to try to lead the people of Israel in a way that would be good for everyone, doing the things that God wants the people to do under this new king. Now, how do you think it worked out? Not so great sometimes. But we're going to get a little bit into that. We're actually going to talk a little bit about both Saul and the guy that comes after him, because there's actually two kings in this story. The stuff we have tonight is a tale of two kings, story about Saul and David. So why don't we just catch a quick video to give us some cliff notes on this, and then we'll talk a little bit more about it.
God's story, David and Saul. So part of God's story is about two guys named David and Saul, and it begins like this. You may have heard of David before, the little shepherd boy who stood up to the massive warrior Goliath and won. But that isn't the whole story. In fact, that's really only a part of it. The rest of the story starts with a man named Saul. See, God wasn't very happy with Saul, Israel's first king. The people of Israel had begged God's prophet Samuel to give them a king so they could be more like other nations. God warned the Israelites they would regret it, but gave them Saul as their king. And like anyone, King Saul wasn't perfect and soon started to mess up, disobeying God and leading Israel away from him. And that's where our friend David comes in. God wanted a new king to replace Saul, so he sent Samuel to a man named Jesse. Jesse showed Samuel his eldest sons, big and strong men. Samuel thought for sure that one of these impressive boys was to be king, but God had other plans. God told Samuel to find another son, so Jesse brought in little David. Even though David was a little scrawny and had the smelly job of taking care of sheep, God told Samuel to look at more than his appearance. Samuel obeyed and anointed David, God's special way of choosing people. When David was anointed, the good spirit that had been helping Saul rule left him and was replaced with a new spirit that wouldn't leave him alone. Imagine there was a bee buzzing around in your brain that you couldn't do a thing about. That may be what it was like for Saul. Since Saul was going a little crazy, His servants had David, a great harp player, come to the palace and play music to calm the king. Now, one day, David came to bring his brothers, who were working as soldiers, some lunch. What started out as a lunch delivery soon turned into one of the most famous stories in the Bible, where tiny David took down the massive warrior Goliath with a single stone. After this, David was like a famous rock star. In fact, David was so popular that Saul worried people would start thinking David should be king instead. Saul began to try and kill him, sending him on dangerous quests where any normal guy would have died, and even threw a spear at his head once. Eventually, things got so bad that Jonathan, Saul's son, who David had become great friends with, helped David escape. David wandered for years trying to stay out of Saul's grasp. Twice, Saul even got so close that David had the opportunity to kill him. But David refused to kill the king in charge. David continued to flee from Saul for years, and without God's blessing, Saul's army was losing to the Philistines. Soon enough, Saul's army had been defeated. Jonathan had died, and the Philistines were now chasing them. Saul was so afraid of capture that he chose to fall on his own sword instead of letting the Philistines catch him. When David heard of Jonathan and Saul's death, he went out and avenged them. And with Saul dead, David returned to Israel and at last took his place as God's new king. And that's the story of David and Saul. So, in case you missed it, here's the quick version. God made Saul king. Saul disobeyed God. God said he would take the kingdom away from Saul and chose David. David became popular. Saul became fearful of David. David had to run away. David wandered for years. Saul died. David avenged Saul. David took over as Israel's chosen king. And that's a part of God's story.
All right. So, in that story, you got David, you got Saul. What was the relationship between the two? Saul was the first king. David was kind of the other guy. Did they get along well? Not so much, right? David was kind of the one who Saul got kind of jealous of, right? Saul, after he didn't do a great job as king in the first place, lost the blessing of God and so started going a little bit crazy. What are some of the things that Saul did against David that we saw in the video? Yeah? Tried to kill him, yeah, a whole bunch of times. Like sometimes he'd send him out on terrifying missions. One time he tried to throw a spear at him. All kinds of things because he was so jealous that people liked David more than they liked Saul, and he was afraid that God liked him more than he liked Saul too. Now, Saul, there were some things he had done well as king, but he was a human being like any other. And he did a lot of things that weren't great too. And so that ends up leading to his own downfall, which leads to David taking his place. Now, something about David that's really kind of cool. You saw a part of it when Samuel's going out to pick that second king, and he goes to this guy named Jesse, and Jesse shows him all of his sons. And was David like the strongest and most powerful leader of all the sons? Is that why he got picked? No. In fact, Samuel was kind of surprised that God had chosen this little scrawny David as the one who was going to be the next king. But God said to Samuel, look, Samuel, you're looking at David like ordinary people look at each other. You're looking at him like, oh, who's going to be the toughest general and all of these things. I'm looking at David's heart. And David's heart, God said, is a heart that's after my own heart. And I know that he will do things as king that will be absolutely great. And so that's how God ends up choosing David. And so after Saul dies, David becomes the next king of Israel. Now, do you think that David did a great job as king? He actually did pretty good. He did a pretty good job as king as far as kings go. In fact, to this day, David is seen as one of the best kings that the people of Israel ever had. Do you think that that means that David was a perfect king? He was not. In fact, you're going to learn a little bit more about this in your small groups, but there were some things that David did that were absolutely awful. There's a story that's particularly important about David's story where when David is king, he's wandering around town and he looks up and he sees this woman on a roof, and she's taking a bath on the roof, right? And he is immediately just in awe of how beautiful this woman is. And so David goes and he sleeps with her. Turns out this woman is the wife of his most loyal soldier, a guy named Uriah, who was out fighting a war for him. And David just went and committed adultery, which is sleeping with someone who's not your spouse, with Uriah's wife. He ends up, Bathsheba, the wife, ends up getting pregnant by King David. And King David tries to trick Uriah into thinking that the baby is his, but it doesn't work out. And eventually, he ends up plotting to have Uriah murdered. Right? This is a pretty big deal. Again, Uriah is like his most loyal soldier. And so what he does is he writes a note, and he gives it to Uriah, and he says, Uriah, I want you to take this note, and don't look at it, but take this note and bring it back to your commander who's fighting the enemy. And give it to your commander, and it's new orders for the commander. Go and do this. And Uriah, of course, being super loyal, says, absolutely, sir. I will go and deliver this message to my commanding officer. Goes and does it. Commanding officer opens the letter, and the letter says, I want you to attack the enemy, and when you're in the middle of the fighting, order a retreat for everybody except Uriah. Signed, King David. So that's what happens. They go out and they fight with the enemy, and in the midst of the battle, the general orders a retreat of everybody except for Uriah. What do you guys think happens to Uriah? He is dead, yes. And what ends up happening is that David gets called to account by this by God through a guy named the prophet Nathan, which I don't think we have time to get into right now, but it's really part of the story of these people who are not perfect and do terrible things in a lot of the ways, and yet God uses them to do also really powerful things. Now, David did some awful things as king, like the whole thing with Bathsheba, but he also was someone who led the people of Israel into a time of great peace. He brought the Ark of the Covenant, which was this golden box that had the Ten Commandments, and he made a place that people could go and be present and worship there. He wrote a whole bunch of the Psalms, which are these songs and these prayers that we have still today as part of worship. And he was someone who led the people in really powerful, powerful ways. I'm going to skip ahead, and you guys can talk through the vocab words and things like that in your small groups because I want to give you time. But I do want to talk a little bit about the Bible verse that we have. Now, this actually is a New Testament Bible verse that comes to us not from any of the Old Testament books, but the New Testament. Luke, the gospel writer, writes this as well, and he talks about King David in conjunction with Jesus. And he says about David, God said, I have found David, son of Jesse, to be a man after my heart, who will carry out all my wishes. Of this man's posterity, or his legacy, that which comes after him, God has brought to Israel a Savior, Jesus, just as he promised. Because here's the thing. David ends up being one of the ancestors of Jesus. That even though he did a lot of things that really were messed up and not good, God was able to use him to bring good things not only to the people of Israel, but to the whole world through Jesus. And man, I'm starting to lose my voice here. So, when you get out to your small groups, you'll have an opportunity to go a little bit deeper into the story of David and looking at the things that he brings into our midst as well. Any questions at all before I let you go? I'm not going to have enough voice to really talk too much about too much stuff. Okay. Go to your small groups, have some good conversation. We'll see you in a bit.